and welcome to Exploring the Scope of Dance Education During COVID-19. So I'm Ellie Kushner. I'm your host and moderator for this event. I am an MSc and I'm the IADMS Dance Educators Committee Chair. I'm also a Pilates and dance instructor, and I co-host Dancewell Podcast. So before we launch into this conversation, which is our third conversation on this platform, I just want to give you a little context. You're watching right now through the Science for Dance Educators page, which is managed by me, Ellie Kushner, as part of the Dance Educators Committee of IADMS. So IADMS stands for the International Association of Dance Medicine and Science. And if you're familiar with IADMS, great. And if you're not, I just want to tell you a little bit about the mission, which is to enhance the health, well-being, training, and performance in dance by cultivating medical, scientific, and educational excellence. And you can learn more about IADMS at iadms.org. And so to the aim of that mission, during this very strange and overwhelming global pandemic, we're producing a series of conversations. And the first was about safe practice, and the second was about conditioning. And our aim with these is to help you as educators really just do the best work that you can to be your safest, healthiest, best teachers. And this week's discussion features three guest panelists who I will introduce in a moment. And we're going to discuss how COVID is challenging and informing pedagogical practice. They'll all frame their experiences with those challenges through a scientific lens, talking about different theories and concepts in science and sort of discussing how these challenges have caused them to reassess or maybe more deeply understand their pedagogical practices. So without further ado, I will introduce the panelists. The first person who you'll be hearing from today is Betsy Coker. Hi, Betsy. Betsy is has a doctorate in education and an MA. She's a dancer, a dance maker, a scientist, and a professor at NYU Tisch School for the Arts. And then next we'll be hearing from Laura Grant. Hi, Laura. Laura is MS in education, a movement and yoga instructor for people ages birth to adult. She's a very tiny little people. And she's a performer and early development specialist. And then thirdly, we'll be hearing from André Megerdichian, who is an assistant professor. Hi, André. An assistant professor of dance at the University of South Carolina. He's the co-artistic director of the Renaissance Collective. He's also a functional range and conditioning movement specialist and a yoga instructor. So I hope I got all those letters in place and qualifications sorted. I'd like to start by also inviting our audience to chime in. So one of the beauties of Facebook Live is that I can see your comments, and I'll be tracking those as they come in. So throughout this conversation, if you have questions or comments or ideas, please feel free to leave a comment, and I will be looking through those and feeding them up to the panelists as appropriate. So I thought we could start with each of you saying just a little bit about who you're teaching, what your population is that you're working with, what your experience has been, and then maybe giving us a clue as to what you want to talk about a little bit more during this conversation. So Betsy, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Hey, everybody out there in the sea of the void that we can't see. So yeah, I teach at NYU Tisch School of the Arts. I'm an assistant arts professor. I broadly teach dance and movement science. So I'm teaching both in the studio and in the classroom. And of course, there's a lot of overlap, not only theoretically, but in terms of action between those two spaces. I teach both undergrads and graduate students, MFA students as well as BFA students, all dance majors. And I've been teaching remotely now for 7 weeks. So I'm excited to talk about just the sort of path that I've gone through in that, and a lot of the things that I've been thinking about specifically relating to the environment. I know we've been all thinking a lot about space, and that idea of sort of the spaces that we're in now compared to the spaces that we were in perhaps a couple months ago. I think that's on all of our minds. My research is largely about structures and environments and how that affects motor skill, both acquisition and refinement. So it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'll talk through some overarching theories that have been helpful for me, and then hopefully through discussion we'll sort of land on some more applicable sort of creative solutions.
Great. And Laura, do you want to tell us a bit about your background and what you're doing right now?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. Thanks for having me, Ellie. It's exciting to be part of. So yeah, my background is in dance. I'm a dancer performer, but also in early education and specifically early development. And so I did my thesis work on using mindfulness and movement practices to support secure attachment. And I'm currently teaching online for toddlers and preschoolers and their families, their parents, and also some mindfulness and movement classes for adults. I've been doing that maybe 5 or 6 weeks. And the thing that I've been thinking most about is nervous system regulation and sort of how that nervous system regulation can, or the dysregulation that happens when we're in a confined space like we are, when there's a lot of unknown, affects our ability to be embodied, and then our ability to really relate in an authentic way with each other. And so I'm excited to talk about sort of why that's happening, and then how we can use that knowledge of that science to inform or to help us better create meaningful connections, even though we can't be in the same room with each other.
Great. I'm getting more and more excited as each of you speaks. André, do you also want to introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your context?
Sure. Hi, I'm André, and I wanted to talk about how do we dream during this time of COVID. And the population I've been working with has been at the University of South Carolina, so theater or dance majors of, freshmen through seniors, and, really looking at what are the practical things that we can do with them that will resonate and move them forward towards this idea or dream that they've had, and what are the realities of, obviously our physical environment, our virtual communication, and what given all of those things is the skill set that dancers have that in some ways makes us uniquely qualified to deal with this situation, because all of us have had some form of injury that has put us out for varying degrees of time, and sometimes it's just a week, sometimes it's a year, and so the way that we've trained, the way we think about and use imagery has been a common part of our practice, but perhaps taken for, I think granted isn't quite the right word, but it's so intrinsic that we don't think about how we use it. And then sometimes we say, well, this is for a rehabilitation phase. And so then we don't necessarily bring it into our practice. But so what do we do? What have we always done? And how does that apply directly now has been the focus of how I've been trying to approach our unique time.
Great. So you can kind of see what we mean by scope in this title. And I think we're all thinking about ideas of how to modify, and everyone on this panel is thinking about how do we allow the context of our situation to shape how we're teaching, right? So Betsy, everybody get your pen and paper ready. Betsy's going to give us some good information here about ecological theory and affordances, right? Betsy, I'm very excited.
Yeah.
She's a great professor. She's a great teacher. So
oh boy,
good. Here we go.
I have my pen and paper because I can't like apparently sit still. If I've learned anything from this teaching online experience is that I just like wiggle all the time. And I can't wander around the studio anywhere while I'm teaching. So I have pen and paper to doodle with. Yeah, so I have been thinking a lot of, the sort of overarching ideas and themes of fundamental motor learning theories. Probably the biggest one being that motor skills are all emerging as a result of the interaction of the individual, the task at hand, and the environment. And so you can't really think about or even talk about or address motor skill acquisition or refinement. And I will start getting towards more creative language. I know I'm talking like a sports person right now, without taking into account all three of those things and the interactions between them. So I'm going to focus specifically on the environment because that just seems to be totally front of mind in teaching in these odd spaces. This is actually, incidentally, the room where I've been teaching my classes. I can give you if the cat's running around, I can give you a better idea of what that looks like in practice. But so overarchingly, thinking about ecological learning and sort of Gibson's 1970s idea about affordances. And so an affordance is essentially any feature in any environment that can suggest action possibilities itself. And it's not, just inherent in an object. Of course, it's in an interaction between the individual and that object, right? So environmental affordances, the action possibilities emerge as a result of the individual's goals. So what goals they have. And of course, in dance teaching, I think we've chatted about this a little bit. It's not just the student's goals, it's also the teacher's goals. And then that sort of negotiation process that happens in between those two things. But then, of course, the intentions and past experiences. So your past experience with an object or in a certain type of space really is going to affect what you think is possible and the assumptions or the limitations of what might be possible in your environment. Some of my favorite way of talking about affordances in this early theory is, so for example, a chair is sit-onable or climb-upable. And if you have a different morphology, you're going to think differently about what is able for that thing. So if I have a small body, very small body, like the students that Laura's working with, a chair may not be imminently sit-onable for me at first. It's going to be more climb-up-onable, right? And, it's when Nellie's seen this, right? Pushable, throwable if you're very strong or the chair is very light. And, if at my age, I've sat on a lot of chairs, I see a chair and I have a sort of cognitive representation that's linked to the action possibilities. But that's not fixed, right? So I, have been thinking a lot about the physical and sensorial environments that I've been teaching in, that traditionally we've taught studio dance in. And I made this little grid for myself and on one side it says studio, and the other side it says home. Home, of course, being any of the other places outside the studio that you might be working. Sometimes if I'm lucky enough where I am, it's warm enough, I can go outside. And I've broken it into the visual environment and the somatosensory environment. And of course, dancers in studios or in any environment are affected by all sorts of other senses. I can talk a little bit about hearing and sound. That's starting to be a new line of research. It's not very much looked into. Mostly we focus on visual and somatosensory. But if we think about the dance studio, the white box, it's actually a bit weird. It is a bit of an odd, I think we're very used to it and we take that with a whole lot of grain of salt, that we tend to practice in these really feature-less environments. And so we think about the dance studio, what you can see. So the visual affordances of a traditional dance studio: mirrors, so yourself, not only a different facet of yourself reflected, which dancers are very used to, but non-dancers find it appropriately odd that we do train that way. And then, of course, other bodies in space. So there is a huge undeniable effect of action observation on learning and beyond the communal experience of dancing around in bodies. I always have said for years, and now I'm, this is what I get for saying how much I love that dancers train in groups of people. And I always thought, well, thank God I'm not a, musician who's like playing the piano in a closet for 6 hours a day. does not fit my personality. And yet here we are. But I think Laura's going to have some suggestions for us for me to figure out how to find that community again. But in the visual environment of a non-studio, I'm just looking around. And this is not a particularly cluttered space, but I'm just sort of looking around my space. It is a much, much more rich visual environment, much more varied visual environment. And, dependent on your relationship to the space that you're in, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, potentially a more emotionally rich environment. I have attachments to the objects that are here. They have some relationship to family, to friends. I'll sort of talk about that a little bit more when I wrap it up, but I just want you to hold in mind these two different visual experiences. And then if we think of somatosensory, so it's the sort of kinesthetic or the felt experiences, what are the somatosensory affordances of being in a dance studio? The first week that I was teaching online with my college students, there were just all sorts of footwear. Like one day I tried sneakers and then that didn't really work. And then one week I tried socks and then I wore a hole in my socks because I'm on a carpet. Right? The floor is really wavy. So there's all sorts of that, my foot felt sensations just standing on the floor. And that is, again, I'm thinking about the studio and the way that floors have developed, have a lot to do with injury prevention and actually some pretty hard evidence that we have about all of that. But again, it's an environment that's fairly featureless. And so in one way, it's featureless because it helps us not trip on things and it helps us have, space for sprung floors and hopefully no poles in the studio, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, I think about the sensorial experience of being in the space that I'm in now. And again, it's this much more stimulating, much more rich and varied, physiologically, emotionally, cognitively. And I just want to bring that up. Of course, I have not yet done any hard and fast research on this. I'm just suggesting this from a theoretical perspective. And so if we think about these, the environments that the students are in often have arisen from the type of curriculum that we've decided upon. So for example, if I'm teaching in a program that has studio dance as part of the curriculum, and in particular, let's say ballet, then the sort of environments that I've decided that I need access to for those students are different, right? So I'm going to have a studio that has a sort of traditional setup, has bars, has mirrors, hopefully has piano or some musical instruments. And of course, now we're in a situation where we don't have those things. But I think that some of us do, some of us don't. And that's a whole other conversation about equity and access. But I think at first, the first sort of thought that I leapt to when I thought, oh no, I have to teach dance online. I have no idea how to do that. And we're all going to have to figure out how to do that. And, beyond staying motivated and showing up for each other and being a community, but actually physically how to do it. We started to think, have a gut reaction to try to teach exactly how we were teaching in the studio in the spaces that are available to us. So sort of massaging the space that I have available to me to fit the requirements of what I had been teaching all along. And what I've arrived at is actually to turn that upside down and to really ask, what is dance? I mean, what does dance even mean? And what can it include that perhaps studio dance traditionally hasn't included? That we know are necessary and beneficial components of becoming a performing artist. But how can I actually let the space that I'm in dictate the kind of curriculum that I'm able to offer? So, for example, I have found that, and this is certainly not only me in my department, I've been following some of the other courses in our department, and we have a big sharing folder of often a lot of the students' work that they're sending in, and it's phenomenal and it's different. And I know the students now differently because of it, and mostly because it's arising out of the spaces that they're in. That in times can be highly personal spaces. It's a bit of an aside, but I found that quite fascinating. That the sort of personalization, the individuality, the uniqueness of how they're responding to their environments. But, improvisation and composition are two of our sort of existing, types of coursework that to me seem to actually be perhaps, this is controversial, better taught or have found at least the sort of affordances in this online distanced realm than they have in the studio. And I do think that a lot of that has to do with, what do I have available to be able to sensorially respond to as this multi-sensate being in a space that I'm in, as opposed to a studio space. And also in a time scale, like, it's really not traditionally acceptable if a student like is in your dance class and then sort of wanders out into the hall and comes back. And, even if they said to you like, well, the exercise fit me much better to explore on the stairs, you'd be like, what? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? But in this sense, like, our students that wander away, sort of mom comes through and like, this is a whole other very full and very rich, opportunity, I think. If I could just bring it back a little bit, thinking about motor learning and motor development and ecological learning and affordances and all of that, movement, and I say development, but of course in the population I'm working with, it tends to be either refinement or creative development, creative movement, invention, arises out of problem solving. And that's true for activities of daily living. That's true for rehabilitation. That's true for developmental milestones in young children. That's true in adults. And that's absolutely true in creative problem solving as well. And so I just really keep thinking about like, well, now we're in this situation where my students they have all this training. They have a ton of training. They have so much training. They're very trained. And they show up, they're super motivated, and they work really hard, and they carry all of this with them to these new spaces. And so now they're moving in an environment that requires new problem solving. So it seems to me that in terms of, sort of developmental motor theory, that this would be just a place of proliferation of all sorts of new ways of moving. And I really think like, if you're plopped down in a new environment, you could think about this from a developmental standpoint. Small child is put down in a new environment, has all sorts of new affordances in it that the child has not interacted with before. They will develop new motor behaviors. They will. The only way that they will not is if they refuse to interact. So to me, that's the sort of big overarching lesson of this, which I certainly did not work into practice within the last 7 weeks. It's ongoing. It's going to keep shifting how I think about teaching. But I do sort of think that one of the more dangerous things that we could do is to try to take students in the spaces that they're in and to restrict them from interacting with their environments. To say like, well, in a studio, you don't have those things. So say like, just move all those things away. Yes, okay, if it's dangerous, you should move the things out of the way. But really like what can happen creatively and what sort of, incredible motor inventions are going to arise because we're encouraging students to do this in a really individual way. And to actually, the final thing I'll say is like, our students tend to, or at least dance tends to happen outside of communities. So the students, and I feel this way too, as a dancer, as a teacher, like I go home and I do my researcher, professor, home life things. And then I go to this very specialized environment and I do my dancey things. And now I see students doing, leg swings and like grandmas in the back and like cats running through. And I just wonder, it's also, they're in their houses, their spaces that are full of them already, many of them. And so in a way, it's like we're bringing our whole self to our practice and also resituating our practice within our community in a different way that I find really fascinating. So not a whole lot of concrete suggestions, but I think we'll get there by the three of us and some questions and comments and all of that. But yeah, some things I've been thinking about.
Great. I'm so inspired, and I see inspiration on the feed as well. A lot of people appreciating your nod to the sensory experiences and sort of this idea, this phrase from Heather about like the richness of our new limitations and people really appreciating that. And you're making me think about how Western dance has really moved itself further and further out of community into these more and more and more and more sterile and specialized environments. And that's, you know, part of recent dance history. Like that's not the heritage of dance, right? That we know on every level that the function of dance is about community. So
I mean, part of this is like being able to be a dancer all the time.
Yeah.
You know, and that it's very now sort of less separate from the other parts of my life. And I have this sort of growing pet peeve where people are like, well, talking about how we used to train as real class. And when we're back in real class, you know, and I think my snippy answer is like, is this not real? like, what is it that we're experiencing right now? Like is this not dance?
All of life is real, right?
Yeah.
We'll talk more about all of this. We'll be having a little more discussion. So please, like I said, add to the comments and questions, and we'll add those to the dialogue. But Laura, do you want to take us through some of what you're thinking about?
Yeah. It's so funny because now that Betsy's talked, I'm like, I just want to respond to everything that you just said. But I'm going to save it and talk a little bit about the sort of particular things that I've noticed with working, especially with very young children, that are a little bit different, I think, than working with highly trained dancers, right, who are very used to this studio space. And the main thing I'm thinking about, and I'm thinking about not just for them, but for me, is this, is what's going on in our nervous system. So Ellie, when you first reached out, you were talking about maybe calling this panel the mind-body connection during COVID-19, right? And so immediately I'm thinking about, well, what's happening to me at this time? My space is confined. I'm in my closet, which is now my home office. My social circle is confined. Touch is limited, right? There's a lot of unknown out in the world, which for us as human beings creates fear. And so like what happens in me when I'm feeling nervous or, and then on top of that, right, I'm having to do all these new things. Like I'm having to teach through a computer screen, which I imagine for not just for me, but for other people, right? It's like, even right now, I can feel I get sort of butterflies in my stomach. There's a tension in my chest a little bit and in the back of my neck. I'm hot and sweaty. I'm not breathing into my belly. I have to remind myself to feel where my legs are on the floor, right? Which I just did and took a moment. But I have noticed that even though I've been teaching for years and years and years, and I'm so comfortable in the studio, I get in front of the screen and suddenly I'm like way up here. And it makes it then hard to connect, right? Because I'm not in my body. And when I'm not in my body, I cannot create that meaningful connection with really anybody, but especially with young people who are always in their bodies. Right? They don't have that that prefrontal cortex that does all that amazing cognition that we have yet. So yeah, I think I've really, it's like, you know, I start teaching online and I've noticed that I'm teaching faster. There isn't that space for conversation. That there was, which is the primary way that we engage, right, is through talking to each other. But in a dance studio also, I think through touch, then there's like an energetic connection that happens there. And I think that, you know, when we try to do other sort of teaching and learning through Zoom, we do things like use the chat box a lot. Or we take turns talking. But that doesn't really work in a dance class, and it certainly doesn't work with 3 and 4-year-olds or 2-year-olds. So I'm thinking a lot about, you know, how can I, as the teacher, integrate the things that I know and that I really learned through my dance practice to support me to adapt to this situation and to support me to be able to regulate and be present. And how can I build more of that into my students' experience as well? And so I want to share just so that we have a sense of what I'm talking about, I want to share briefly just this image of the fight or flight response. So I sort of mentioned these things. Can people see it? Ellie, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is like, I think a lot of us are spending a lot more time in this nervous system state. And when we're in this state, like I said, we can't really connect to ourselves. We can't really connect to others, but we also can't learn. So if we've been out in the world reading the news a lot, or learning of friends who have been sick, or trying to figure out, is it okay for me to go see my friends on their screen porch if we wear a mask, but if we don't wear a mask, maybe it's not okay. It's all of these questions, or when am I going to be able to get back into the studio? This is often what is going on for us. And some of you on the panel who do more kinesiology than I do can probably talk about then how the risk for injury goes up. And we have this sort of inability, right, to gain the motor skills that we're trying to learn. So I think like there's this interesting thing happening where there are these external pressures of the computer and the pandemic that are creating this like disconnect, this mind-body disconnect, but that we as dancers, André said this, right? We have the tools to adapt to this situation. And that in working with really young children, we don't have a choice to slip into the cognitive. So, and we also don't have a choice, I think, to ignore our surroundings. So this is where it goes back to what Betsy has been talking about, where when I ask students to jump, right, I have one little boy who jumps on his couch every single time, right? Because he's like, well, it's there. This is where I am. And there's a comfort level, I think, that there may not be in the studio for young children, for people who are new to dance, and for adults who are not trained movers, right? There's a comfort level with doing things, trying things maybe at home that we might not try in the studio. If you see non-dancers walk into a studio, there actually, I think, is often a lot of like, I don't know what to do here. So yeah, I like Betsy, I'm in process, but I'm thinking a lot about how do we sort of harness our knowledge of embodiment and the tools that we have, these tools of breath, of grounding, of slowing down, of being able to feel our bodies, in order to try to combat some of that disconnection that happens from a screen. And some of it means that dance class looks different. But it also, I think, is an opportunity for us to start to value those tools that we have that are often the sort of taken for granted tools of our dance training. And they're the quiet tools, right? They're not the grand battement or the amazing petit allegro or the like things that we think of as virtuosic, but actually I think are what makes being a dancer all the time like a really kind of amazing way to live, in some ways.
Yeah, that is something we'll talk more about. So in all of these cases, we're going to talk even more about how folks are applying this information. People are loving the jumping on the couch, and I think it speaks exactly to what Betsy was saying. I look at a couch and I think, sit on a ball, and the kid says, it's anything a ball. This is how I'm going to get my jumping in. This is really giving me a sense of flight. Now I know what jumping's about, even though I don't have the calf development to soar into the air. It's really amazing.
Right. And they're getting this, like, all of this feedback from this uneven surface, right? And this cushion and this extra foot development and all these things that they wouldn't get in the
balance challenge.
Yeah,
totally.
Balance challenge, right. All of that.
And I think we spoke separately when we were preparing for this panel. We all sort of spoke about the challenge that we often feel as dance educators of meeting people's expectations for virtuosic skills, but also knowing as experienced, mature dancers that, you know, the ability to breathe and connect and see and explore are really so vital to our craft. And so we will maybe talk about that more when we get into discussion in terms of using those. And I'm glad you didn't say soft skills. Those quieter skills. And great. So André, tell us more about what you're thinking.
Okay. Well, wow. First of all, Betsy and Laura, that was stellar. What puzzle pieces! Like the picture is so much richer now. So thank you. So I've been thinking about, I think, as we've been interacting with students, we can, there's the things that we've been doing, and then the things that we're noticing, right? And at least I have seen, and I have a feeling it's not unique to my students, that there's a despondency. There is a genuine sense of loss. And that's, all the concerts that have been canceled to events like graduation. And I'm sure all of us were involved in projects that have disappeared in the mist. And so when you have that despondency or that grieving process, coupled with the virtual space and then their own physical limitations and their actual space that you guys talked about, it's a lot. And I think that then that situation makes us forget who we are and all the things that we have actually done and experienced, and that they're not actually gone. So how do we dream in this time of COVID? And I think, for me, and I have this feeling that the studio is not actually where we learn. The studio is where we train and we get ideas. And then ideally, we go away and we think about those ideas. We kind of muse on them. We chew them in our thoughts. We might talk about them to our friends. And then, in random places, how about tendus in the kitchen, right? Has anybody done just this? Yeah, right? It's incredible. And then you go back to your studio and you're like, that's not what I remembered from the kitchen. Or, you're in a line, in a grocery store or waiting for public transportation, and you say, can I explore my pelvis drops? What's that weight? Or maybe I'll just lift up my arm and drop it. And because you're chewing on it all the time. When we learn choreography, even if we're not consciously thinking about it, the next day you go into the studio and suddenly you've organized it more, right? And so whether it's conscious or unconscious, we're constantly processing information, and that's where the learning happens. And at some point, with any physical endeavor, there comes, again, you might go, aha, or just one day realize that you've known a thing for so long that you can no longer remember a time of not knowing it. And even though any idea, particularly in dance, as we train and we learn and we grow, decade upon decade, we discover richer and richer aspects of any one given movement. But there is that point where it becomes so rich, you can't go back. And so I think, again, outside the studio is where it happens. Now, it just so happens we're spending a lot of time, or all of our time, outside the studio. So I'm going to circle back around that to a minute. But when we talk about visualization. We do use it a lot, I think, in rehab terms, and we use it in technique class when we're trying to get someone to physically understand a concept. We might give them an image. We use imagery to spark passions or concepts. So we're constantly using it. But sometimes we don't always think about what are the step-by-step activities that we can take. So it's not just an idea, it's actually an idea that manifests in our bodies. So we take it from there, we bring it here, right? And then at some point, we come to a place of understanding. We put that aside because now it lives in us, and then we move on to the next idea. What's that next idea? You muse on it, you have the idea, you take a series of actions, you manifest it, and then it's as if you always knew it. I mean, you move on to the next idea. So sometimes I think that as dancers, we have these goals and these ambitions, right? And there's the broad goal of, I want to be a dancer. I think, that's a common one. I want to be a dancer. What does that actually mean, to be a dancer? There's, the broad idea. I guess when I think of dancer, my idea of it, and I do feel like there's probably as many dancers as there are probably that many ideas of what it means to be a dancer. But for me, it's a deeply humanistic, hyper-aware athlete who is able to channel radical forces of physics and highly turbulent emotional states and move that through the medium of the body. Now, that's an idea. How do if someone says, this is what I need you to be, how do I do that? What are the day-to-day steps that I need to do, right? Because it's a little overwhelming. And then you couple that with the human, like, I want a job in a company, and you pursue those things. And so we go and we take our technique classes, going to class, going to rehearsal, performing. That's how I'm going to achieve these big things. But it's actually not. Or let me say, it's just a small part. So when we break anything down into a component part, there's the skill. Dancing is a series of skills. It's an acquiring of athleticism, and then it's in the harnessing of those skills and that athleticism to the imagination, right? So the discipline and the imagination create the artist, right? And one without the discipline or the imagination, then the artist can't really fully come into being. So here's something really simple. If you have an injury, let's say it's a lower extremity injury, okay? So you can't run around. You can't even time at this moment because you can't stand up. What can you do? You probably drink a lot of water, right? Or you drink anything, right? Whatever it is, okay? So typically we drink. Now here, all right, so I have this water bottle. Now I think typically when humans drink, I won't use this. I'll use this. So typically we drink and we move the glass, right? If anybody has a glass available, if they'd like to try it, if you have a glass available, right? Just drink the way you normally drink. What does that look like? Right. So we move the wrist. Maybe there's a little bit of a neck action. Okay. Well, what about high release? Right? That the high release, which is, we use it in dance all the time, right? It's the lifting of the heart to the heavens. So, okay, that's not really kinesiology, I suppose, but let's just use that poetic example. It's an image. I lift my heart to the heavens. Now, what if I choose to drink water that way? So I lift my heart to the heavens. Try it. Now, careful. The water is going to move a little bit differently than you're accustomed to. Okay, so now every time you take a drink of water, you are practicing high release. if you do that day in and day out, I can say quite assuredly that your high release will become so intrinsic to you that it will be just part of who you are, right? And now every time you drink anything, whatever it may be, people might look at you like, are we in a Marvel movie? Do you have to drink like a superhero all the time? So there's that. Beautiful. So now let's look at subtler things. I think we all tend to get, who hasn't heard, you're sloping your shoulders or, fifth position. Yeah, shoulders come up a lot. And a lot of that is because we don't have a full awareness of our scapular rhythms, right? And so, all right, how do we do that? That's, I can't go to the fridge right now. I know you're in front of your computers. If you can move them, go ahead, go to the fridge. And now, when we open the fridge, we tend to schlep over there and, and we reach for the fridge and we pull it open and we kind of stand like this and, check it out. We survey the scene. What if we made that a scapular extravaganza? So I'm going to stand away from the fridge and I'm going to reach with my fingers towards the fridge until I feel a protraction in my scapula. Now I'm going to have an awareness in my hand and I'm going to feel my hand actually wrap around that handle. And now from here, I'm not going to use my elbow just yet. I'm going to feel my scapula retract. You'll feel your carriage open, and then you can pull the fridge and then have a look at what's inside, right? You pull out the milk carton, take a high release, put it back. So those are simple things. If you want to practice undercurves, well, we have enough space to practice an undercurve of the pelvis, which is, right, the pelvis drops and moves and shifts and drops and come back. If it so happens that you're in a space that you can't do an undercurve, we can practice gravity by lifting the arm up and dropping it down, right? It's just a habit, but I think we all have an experience. If you've ever been in a Limon class or any release technique, that releasing is easier said than done. It takes a high degree of training and awareness to actually release your body to gravity and keep just enough of yourself remaining that you can recover from that. It's a long and highly developed skill set, but you don't need to be in a studio to do that. You go to the studio maybe to train it in context of a lot of other movements. So anyway, if we take those simple explorations that you're going to do all the time, and you might do without actually realizing that you're doing it, and you couple that with the idea that, okay, if you're injured, this is a great time to deal with that injury. I'm doing that now with several injuries. If you're not injured, well, usually when you're taking time off for dancing because of an injury, you're just rehabbing that injury. But if you're not injured, okay, this is the time. This is the time, dancers, to really dig in to what your body is capable of doing on an athletic level. So this is one of the things that I did with my students, because I wasn't, when this all kicked off, I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to teach online yet. I didn't have a grasp for it, and so I thought, what can I do? So I made a video series of me demonstrating different leg training exercises. I made a template for those exercises and a progression for those exercises, and then we checked in every week, and they were doing those. They were asking questions, and because they weren't concerned about getting through multiple technique classes, multiple rehearsals, the several performances they had to do throughout the season, they weren't worried for themselves in that way, which is, you know what, that's real. We can't train in season the way we do out season. But what's out season for a dancer? It's you're in school for, at least in academic setting, you're in school for 9 months, then you go and you do summer workshops. You're in it all the time. So when we remove the fear of getting through the work, then we can actually focus on an aspect of training that is often overlooked for the dance population. And so they dug into that, the intensity, because they do miss intensity, right? Dancers are physical, vitally physical, right? And we need to feel ourselves pushing against these unmovable forces in some way. So when we take the subtle practices of the high release with the water, coupled with really highly engaged body weight strength training protocols, then we're actualizing ourselves. Yeah. The subtle skills, the athletic skills, and because we still have the dream, the vision. This is me being able to jump. This is me being able to travel through space when the time allows. Then that dream of dancer still is moving forward. And I think that's what we need. We need to feel that we're moving forward. We're not victims of our circumstance. We are using our circumstance the way we use gravity, right? It's like a dragon, you harness it and you fly. So I think that's what's available to us now. And that is, well, you have your good days and you have your bad days. But I think, one movement experiment at a time, we just do it.
I'm so inspired by all of you. Thank you so much. Yeah, you were saying, you get better and better at the high release, and you get better and better at being a dancer, don't you? I mean, that's really what you're saying. And somebody wrote in and said, Helen was saying she had a young dancer who said, I just don't even remember the point of dancing anymore. So a lot of sort of what you're getting at, André, is to do with motivational stuff, right? And we had talked in our past conversation before all of you joined us about sort of extrinsic and intrinsic, and how we're starting to see among students maybe some of those more extrinsically motivated dancers are struggling, and the intrinsically motivated ones are maybe able to endure. But I don't know that we have any. I say that with caution, just as a hypothetical. There's no fact evidence about that. What I'm also thinking, André, about what you said in terms of like this period kind of reflects maybe a period of, if you were injured and you have any other circumstances that might bring you out of dance, and also how, yeah, you can do your high release when you have an ankle injury. You can still do the scapular, opening of the fridge, and how there's also a lot of talk sort of in the zeitgeist right now about this opportunity opening up some more diversity in our field, whether that's like neurodiversity or diversity in terms of genres. Both Betsy and Laura sort of spoke about that a little bit, that it's not just maybe if you have an ankle injury, but if you have MS and you're not able to walk around campus, but now maybe you can actually do a dance class when everybody else is also limited in their physical movement, and we all are having to think more about how do we find movement in these limitations. Any reflections on that? It's a little bit ambling, but
I mean, I can relate to sort of what I was telling you anecdotally. Was that yesterday? I've lost all track of the days. Just accept it. In that, through this teaching in our current curriculum in this way, and sort of, as André is saying, like starting to arrive at some ideas of how to do this best. I also direct the summer high school program for dance at Tisch, and it's very much modeled on our BFA program for exactly that point, that to give the high school students an idea of what it might be like to be a BFA student in our department. And I just totally overhauled the curriculum for this summer because it's online. And so now they're starting every day with improvisation, which I would like to, this is like my passionate plug for improv practice, that it is and can be, it's not just a creative endeavor, although it is, of course, a creative endeavor. I mean, improvisation practice is and can be intensely physical, and a really intensely physical way of training, I think, in a lot of the same ways that we think of studio technical practice. But in any case, a lot of the other curriculum changed too, and I started to get some interest from students who would perhaps not have or hadn't been in the past interested in our program. And, emails from people saying things like, I've only ever studied hip hop, and like, I know that Tisch does like a lot of ballet and contemporary, and I've never really done ballet. And I just had this really amazing, I was like, oh my, I totally not intended this to happen, but now this curriculum, there's absolutely no barriers towards style. There's no prioritization of any kind of particular dance style. And like, the point of the program is it's very compositionally oriented. So it is about the students creating their own works, and how totally exciting is that, and how completely needed is that. And that was, just sort of a surprise byproduct. I hope that there are more surprise byproducts like that.
Laura, you had some experience too with sort of that?
Yeah, so I teach dance, primarily creative movement, improv, but also yoga, mindfulness, sort of mindful movement, somatic-y stuff. And a lot of those, I think that those spaces can feel really intimidating to people who don't have a lot of movement experience. I think they also are, I know this is true for yoga, I think it's probably true for Pilates. A lot of things are seen as contemporary dance, sometimes ballet, seen as spaces that are for white people, for thin people, for young people, for able-bodied people. And being able to access that material from the comfort of your own home without being seen, not even by the teacher, I think creates an opening for people. So I taught a mindfulness and movement class for public school educators. We had a lot of people on who had never done anything like that before. Nobody had their video on the whole time, which for me as a teacher was super weird, but was also a real practice in trust and in trusting people to be in charge of their own bodies, which I think as dance teachers we don't do a lot of. And people really loved it and had really positive feedback to stay at the end, and at the end people turned their videos on and said hello. But I think it was it opened up space, and it challenged for them, and it challenged me as a teacher to really have to refine my language and have to think about what are all of the possible challenges that people might experience when doing this, and how can I provide some support for all of that, as opposed to being like, you're engaging your quad too much when you're trying to develop A or whatever it is, and instead speak more broadly. And so I think it opens up possibility to diversify the field, but also for us as teachers to start to make our teaching more accessible to people.
It's hard to find the balance in the sort of acknowledgement of how difficult these times are, and not wanting to be glib about what's going on, and not wanting to be too there's so much we can learn, but that there really is so much we can learn. And I am sensing this sort of resistance, we're being forced to do things, and it's not how we're used to doing it, and there's some brittleness, and the brittleness is creating breaking, and sort of the ability to be flexible and kind of move through this is going to be, I think, very important. And even now with the addition of the masks, and there's a lot of dialogue about masks, and I keep thinking, we are right in the middle of this right now. It's going to take, what are we, not in New York, this is week 10 or something. All the medical people are saying it's about 2 years, that this is going to be a process before we can get some herd immunity and vaccination. So we're really very much in the middle of this, and some of you have spoken about, like, you don't know if your universities are starting again, and you might start back, but then there might be a second wave and we might have to retreat again. And so how do we, I think as dancers, maybe we have that capacity to be both very rigid with our training and very focused and very disciplined, but also as artists to be flexible and curious and adaptive and responsive. So how are you all exploring that, and how does that relate to sort of the science also that you've introduced to this dialogue?
Well, I think of it as transition. I think we spend a lot of time working on a transitions between movements, and we want to be, graceful and beautiful and all those things. But in reality, and at least speaking for myself, times of transition, whether, just learning some really new way of moving or choreographing, or, going from professional life into a teaching life, or any transition, falling in love to the other end of that, right? It's never as graceful as I'm in the retrospect, I'm never as graceful as I thought I was before that transitionary period happened, right? Yeah. It really turns out that, internally, I'm constantly room wrecking. I'm spazzing out up there, and having all kinds of thoughts and frustrations, and then, what happens? You eventually evolve through that state, and you make the change. This is unique, right? I mean, we don't have any parameter for it, so it doesn't necessarily fit all the life transitions that one is accustomed to going through. Those landmarks of graduating from high school or college, or falling in love or getting married or children. These are the recognizable landmarks. Global pandemic is not a recognizable landmark. However, what is recognizable is that we are no doubt in a time of change. And we will no doubt figure out a way through this. And when we do, we won't be the same. Right? Because that's what a transition is. You were one thing, and then you're another thing when you emerge, right? And if the butterfly, or if the caterpillar understood what was going to happen to it when it was in that cocoon, it most likely would not make that cocoon, right? It would do everything to avoid it, and it would just keep on crawling along trees and munching on leaves and being like, I'm not doing that cocoon thing, because it doesn't understand the butterfly later. So I guess I just keep trying to tell myself that I don't know, and I'm having all these feelings that are difficult to navigate. Again, we're talking about grief on a really genuine level, right? And that, even though we've experienced it in different ways, every time it hits on that deep animal brain part of us, it's new. But we will adapt, and we will find ways to communicate with each other, and we will find ways to perform, and we will find ways to create community, which is what this is all about, I think, because on an intrinsic level, we need to connect. We need to be heard, and we need to hear. And so our language has been taken from us, but we are actively, here we are, we're making this, we're having this conversation. People are coming to this conversation because we're figuring it out. And I think we just need to know that we're freaking out right now, and it's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, anyone else?
Yeah, I think, I had just a couple of things. One on the more sort of theoretical research end of things, and one that André has lit in me by talking about dreaming and the sort of future dreaming of dancers and dance students. But firstly, I think this is this is sort of a backdoor into being able to experiment and practice with why a dance class is structured the way that it is. I had this conversation with Dick McGill, who's a fantastic motor researcher, sort of major figure of the motor learning research field. But he said, and a big fan of dance, major fan of dance. I think he sees more dance than I do. But and he said to me, why did you do bar before center? And I could not come up with like a really good defensible, like scientific answer for him. And then he started asking, well, why is it that you always turn before you jump in class? And I was like, I don't know. and it's like these sort of like really broad, curious, scientific thought process sort of questions that now it's like, well, I have this fireplace. It's lovely. It's not the best bar for when I'm teaching a ballet class. So like maybe now we can experiment and have some anecdotal evidence about what that's actually good for. And that is really exciting to me. On the other hand, this idea about one of the major dreams, and I'm totally projecting my past dance student self, is performing. I mean, for me, that was like the whole reason. I love going to class, and I'm happy to report that doing a développé in this bedroom still feels as good to me as doing one in the studio. And actually, I think I still have to take class now to remind myself that, even when I feel resistant and glum, I do the développé and I'm like, right. It feels good. It's still, all of that is still here. Like, it feels good. But Donnie Shizono, fantastic, radical, experimental choreographer. She once said, I was doing a workshop with her, and she once said, and it was at St. Mark's Church, so it had this whole other like historical feeling about it. She said that, gathering together to see a live performance is going to be, and this was probably 15 years ago, is going to become the most radical thing that we can do. And I think that was a response to different ways that we're consuming media and different sort of priorities in culture. I'm not quite sure. And that really struck me. I was like, there is a reason that I feel that way. I feel that way when I go to class. There's something about being in groups of people and seeing something that's happening in that sort of time. And, I feel really, really sad about that, like really deeply sad about that. On the other hand, the students that I've been seeing coming through our program and seeing the work that they're creating that is happening in real time, that is being disseminated and consumed by living people, who are experiencing this real time. That's performance. It's absolutely performance. It has all of the same elements of a lot of the things of performance that I dreamed about as a student. So I do think like the way that we're thinking about what is performance? What is the dissemination of this thing that we're creating and constantly recreating? And people are consuming it for sure. And how do we serve those things? And like for the students who really come alive in those sorts of modes, like how do we create situations to serve them to keep making that? That's been keeping me going for the last few weeks, just logging in and seeing some of these, some live sort of Facebook event, and then other video work and collaborative video work and Zoom video instantaneous co-collaborations have been just mind-blowing. And I'm super grateful for it. So that's it's like the quick and dirty pros and cons.
Yeah, I too have been getting these emails of student work, the sophomore comp class, here's their work, or the students put together this workshop. Normally it happens in the black box theater, but now it's happening online. And there was a little part of me when I first started getting those emails, there was a little bit of dread in opening those emails. So I just was worried that they would be just such a pale comparison to the live performance experience. But when I opened them and started watching them, that was not the case. They were really their own unique medium, and they gave me, heart melting insights into these students that I wouldn't get in other contexts, so there really is that something to be gained there. Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about that rigidity and flexibility? I know that sort of gets into your developmental movement wheelhouse. Lead us through yielding and pushing.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this when André, you were talking about, I think I wrote this down because it was so beautiful. You said we release into gravity, but we leave just enough of ourselves remaining so that we don't fully collapse. And yeah, in developmental movement, infant developmental movement, we talk about these 4 patterns: yield, push, reach, pull, and they sort of go in these cycles, right? And in order to really have an efficient and effective physical push, there has to be a yield first into the surface so that we can feel what we are going to push against. And if you see it in an infant, right, an infant, the first thing they're doing is they're just yielding. That's it. And then from there, they can start to push, and then they can start to reach with their head, with their eyes, right? Look at things. And this world that we're living in, this situation, I said this before, there's this contraction of space in a lot of ways. And this, there's a lot more boundaries around our lives for many of us. And if we don't yield first into these boundaries, right, we're just like the pushing can't really happen. But there's something, and we're stirring up this, we're only living in the difficult emotions. And that's not to say that we can't have them, right? That part of the yielding is accepting, like, yeah, it's sad. Like, I'm freaking so sad that I was working on the most exciting project I've been working on in maybe the last 10 years. And it's just fully canceled. That's it. Nothing's going to happen with it. And that's sad. And there's a lot of, like, we're like experiencing like mass death, right? And that's also really sad. But part of the yield is allowing ourselves to feel that. And then we can actually go somewhere, right? Because we're not stuck in this place of ineffectively pushing against a thing. And then we can push our way to somewhere, and we can reach for the things that we want, and we can grab them and pull them towards us when we know that they're there. And I think there's a way also, I've experienced this in my own life, and I imagine that there are a lot of people who have experienced this, that for those of us who are not worried about paying our rent, not worried about feeding ourselves, right? That the contraction, the increased boundaries and the lack of choice creates actually, it's easier then to yield, right? When the boundaries are close, we don't have to go searching for them. And the yielding can happen, and then there's all this opportunity for expansion. We know this from research on toddlers, right, and young children and child development, right? The limits create the sense of safety and security that kids then can experience freedom within. The same with, like, right, when we have all of that stuff in our environment, like Betsy was saying, when we have a lot of things to problem solve, we can actually get more motor skills than if we're in a big open space with nothing in it. So yeah, I think that part of my practice, personally, professionally, all of this at this time has been like, how can I hold this, like this Venn diagram, this both and of like, there's this contraction, there's this expansion, right? There are these boundaries within it. There's this freedom, there's this grief, which is real. And there's also this like incredible joy that I get, and I get goosebumps even just talking about when I can turn on my screen and see my little people, and we turn on music and we turn on, you know, whatever it is, and we all dance around our living rooms with our scarves, and some of them have paper towels and some of them have toilet paper because like maybe they don't have a scarf at home, but there's this joy and there's this human capacity for moving our bodies in rhythm for the purposes of creative expression that is not lost. Even though there's also this grief around like live performance being like not being tangible right now in the same way.
So somebody who wrote in on Facebook, Shelley, was sort of getting at these, she was appreciating this idea of using this time as a moment for exploration, and she also brought into her comment the lack of measurable outcomes that we're with right now. and how freeing that is as well. So it's like we're not fixated on the things that are so measurable, like we can't jump, so it's not about the glorious jump. It's, everybody, there's something right next to you. You can't whack your leg up to your ear, and how that also stripping away those measurable outcomes can also create more freedom. And then there's
I would also, sorry.
Go ahead.
I mean, just about the jump, it's like, well, maybe, like, why not still jump where you can, but not for the purpose of measuring or getting better at it.
Yeah.
So that the jump becomes actually a different thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Or in the conditioning panel, we were talking a little bit about like, well, maybe you can't do that leap with the point in the back leg here and all the technical things, but you can do a human jump. You actually don't need to have perfect floors to put on a pair of trainers or sneakers and just jump up and down a couple times. I mean, my poor neighbors, but I live in an apartment building, but besides that, we can still do these things, but the freedom that sort of taking away the virtuosity brings. But I think that also does create conflict with our students, the way Helen was saying earlier, her students sort of feeling like the student who felt like, what's the point of jumping? And she also mentioned that, like, for a lot of, she was talking about 9-year-olds, like the socialization really is such a big part of that class. The truth is, if you're teaching at a studio anywhere, like, and you have a bunch of 9-year-olds, there might be 3 of them in the room who are really ready to go deep into the content of dance and find the high release. And, and there might be 12 in the room who just, it's an after school activity. They like their friends, the teacher is fun, and they like to groove around a little, so these different, how do we sort of, and Joe was also asking about, like, how do we meet students where they're at? And I think, I don't know if you come across this, Laura, but certainly for those of us in the academic, university setting, that's a big, that's always, I think, the struggle, this sort of balance between meeting their needs and meeting our syllabus and our goals. So any comments on those ideas?
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I think actually it's really clear working with young children, this idea of like, why do we dance? What does it mean to be a dancer? And that there's right, if you ask any professional dancer, pretty much all of them say, I just really love it so much. I just love it. There's like nothing that makes me happy the way that dancing makes me happy. And so how can we find the joy that gets so lost when I don't teach in those pre-professional training programs, but having been in intense training, like I lost joy for a long time and had to even step away from dance, right? Because I also didn't have the tools to deal with the challenges and the rigor and the injuries and all of those things. And like, I think André was saying, it's like, this is this opportunity to cultivate these skills and to like refocus on the joy. Because if it's not joyful, like certainly don't do it in your living room. Right. Go for a walk, or it's, I don't know. That's
yeah. I mean, and also maybe it's okay for, I know we're also looking at a economic situation. I mean, I recognize who I'm speaking to. I recognize that you might own studios, or like, I mean, my career depends on people wanting to be in dance class for sure, but maybe it's okay for some kids to realize that what they love about dance is the social component. Like, maybe that's okay for them to recognize that now. I do recognize, if that means you don't have as many people enrolled next fall, I acknowledge how complicated that is. But André,
I mean, yes and no. Oh no, sorry. Go ahead, André, please. No. Okay. I don't know if I'm to the left of you on your screen, but you did just very effectively gesture towards me. No, it's good. Dance skills at work. No, I think it can be, it's not either or. I was teaching a group of students that I worked with, so for the last quarter, so it actually aligned with this whole shift to online learning. I started working with these students for 7 weeks, nearly every day. And these are, again, like highly motivated, super trained. They come to class without fail. They remains even more engaged in class than I was when I was taking other classes. And I mean, I honor them. Like, it's just incredible. I'm amazed by them. And about 3/4 of the way through, I had one of my students who emailed me like, we miss seeing each other dance. You know, like that actually is a really big part of why they go to class, in addition to all of the other, you know, needing and wanting to train and loving to dance and wanting to be performers. And he suggested that, you know, we can go in groups, and that group one can watch group two, and that if they wanted to, they could pin individuals. And I will say that the first day that we did that, I was just watching their faces, watching each other, and they just completely, like, I mean, it was joy. I got teary. So, I mean, I think it can be both. Like, they have been through so much together, and it was, you know, in a way, in the studio would have been framed as this very rigorous, you know, action observation and learning and sort of, you know, being, you know, critical, positively critical, and having that whole process. And I was just like, whatever, like, throw it out the window, just like watch each other dance and smile. And like, they were so happy. So I do think like that, thinking that was a major sort of step forward, and it was this one student's idea, you know. And I think from that, I've been trying to explore all these other ways to, again, not recreate what we do in the studio, but actually try to find new ways of getting at some of those joys.
Yeah, and I don't want to dismiss that kid who likes to go to dance class because it's a social experience. Like, I don't mean to suggest that, because, again, this is the history of dance. You know, we come together, we dance to celebrate a wedding, we, you know, dance to hope for a good harvest. You know, like, the social and communal component of it is absolutely integral to the experience. And in some ways, it takes me back to what Betsy said at the beginning, where in a lot of ways, Zoom is just kind of like the last piece. I mean, we have been moving dance out in our Western sort of contemporary modern ballet dance. We've been moving dance further and further out of the community, and Zoom is just like the last boot out the door, you know, if we're not careful. So it's not, maybe that this is an opportunity for us to see that, like, well, how can dance get back into the community, not back to the studio, but back into other places. And there are places where in Florida, you know, they're able to gather a little bit, and they have nice weather, and they're doing their dance class in the park, and sort of like Betsy's saying, like, what does this do for us on a bigger picture level? And
what does it mean for the person who happens to be driving by that park?
Exactly.
Like, I take bar here in this room every afternoon, and Tyler Peck, thank you. I've been loving the Tyler Peck Ballet Bar. And, you know, there's people who walk down the street and who see me, like,
yeah.
And I just wonder, like, it's not a performance necessarily, but that is somehow meaningful. It's like this recentering of dance. You know, I spend so much time thinking about recentering dance in the, like, institutional academy. And that's just like this one tiny little nest that I live in. Yeah.
Yeah, André, what were you going to say too?
I had these two thoughts, and you know, sort of piggybacking on what everyone is saying is, you know, I think anything that gives you, you know, an awareness of, like, oh wow, I really miss, say, the social aspect. Like, that's a profound discovery.
Yeah.
You know, because we can take our situation for granted, that we walk into a place rich with people and personalities, and we do this communal thing together. And we, you know, particularly a wedding, we might be a little bit more cognizant because it's such a special event. But a dance class, you know, when you start, you know, 5-6 days a week, you know, maybe you go in and you're not even thinking about, like, I'm just so tired. Okay, I'm going to do this thing, right? So now, you know, it's in that removal of it, the awareness of it is, that's, I mean, again, I don't mean to say everything is just dandy, but I would say it's a silver lining, that awareness and that appreciation of togetherness. You know, and if dance is a reflection of its time, or it can be art art can be a reflection of its time. Certainly this what we're doing now and what we're navigating now, we are reflecting our times, and we are figuring out how best to bring this art form to people that might not necessarily have access to it or an interest in it, but will suddenly stumble upon it. In the same way that I don't know if you guys have done this, but to reach out to people that you haven't spoken to in a while, that suddenly that long distance relationship becomes more normal. So we are seeking out intrinsically, I think. So that's good. Then I wanted to completely change subjects for a second and go back to some, there was a comment about why jump.
Oh yeah.
And I was thinking too about training and dance training and the rigor of it and the professional aspirations of it can really detract from, the sheer human running and jumping and playful nature, in the way that kittens run and jump and play in training to practice to hunt. But, let's say we take out the hunting aspect and go back to the play aspect. Dancers can often be trained out of playing. And so in order to jump, the body has to be organized in a certain sequence of events that whatever the medium is, suddenly your arms have to travel through first position and then open, and that's the only way to get near. And so the training doesn't necessitate optimal or full muscular engagement. Mm-hmm. We've trained the pathway and we jump well doing it because we've trained it, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're recruiting all our muscles in order to achieve the event. So that's why plyometrics is so great. And I think there have been a number of different studies that plyometric training and just force production, training and force production, even though you don't move your arms through those trained pathways, by taking the human pathway repeatedly and over time, then when you go back to reframing it through whatever the dance construct is that the greater force production does lead to greater jump height. So we can train to jump. Yeah. It's not gone, and we can jump onto our bed and off of our bed and onto the bed and off of the bed. The couch is great. Running through the park is great. So, we can bring, while we're bringing the virtual, we're discovering the virtual, we can also go outside and discover the human and bring that back into our playful natures.
Yeah, I think we need to wrap up, but I did just want to go back one more time to the social thing, just because it's coming up a lot. A lot of other people, Sam and Rachel, are sort of like resonating with Helen's comment about the social thing. And I would ask you all, Sam and Helen and Rachel and others who are thinking about this, like, will this knowledge of how important the social piece is, will it change how you design your class now if you are online or quarantined? Will it change how you design your class going forward if you do get back into the studio? Has this experience made evident to you something that will affect your pedagogical practice? So, like folk dances, our circle dances, our social dances, will you think about like, oh, instead of doing everything in like a frontal, 6 different people in their separate boxes facing front, will we start to see more changes in how classes are structured and dances are made? And I'm just curious, so I don't know if they'll write in and tell us, but I'm going to put that out there. Let's just go round robin and just get some closing remarks. Betsy, do you want to just give us a finishing thought?
I'm absolutely terrible at conclusions, like horrible. Like I'm like so happy to write a whole paper, and then I get to conclusions, and I'm like, I don't know. Like it's all in there. Just I don't know. So maybe I won't go, and I'm going to resist. I'm not going to go in that direction. But you just made me think that my class and I were sort of chuckling about this, like So Cunningham's, no fixed points. How many years ago was it? How many decades ago was that?
Wait,
I'm not so good at my dance history, but
the book No Fixed Points.
Yeah. But this idea of no fixed points, no fixed center,
I don't
right?
know. Yeah.
So we're like many, many decades past that, and it took this to make me realize that we're like really not. Like we actually haven't even gotten there. I'm like creating these exercises and the students saying, did you start on your right or your left? And I was like, does it matter? I don't, just do one side and then the other side. Who cares? Like you're not gonna bump into anybody. Like just stuff like that. Like it's what are the traditional sort of really strict requirements that like aren't really necessary actually, and what part of those like Laura was saying that might actually be intimidating and restrictive for some people that we can shed now, and like really live in this full Cunningham, like everything's available sort of space. Yeah, that's all. That's my conclusion.
Great. Laura. Yeah. Laura, you're muted. Sorry.
There were so many things talked about that are making me just feel excited about dancers and dance people and the dance community and how we think and move. And but I think I'll just comment on this social thing, which is like, I said, why do we dance? For the joy, but the joy comes, I think, from the connection with other people in a lot of ways. I teach young kids, and so the social element is actually the primary focus of my classes, because really what kids are learning is how to be in relationship. But I think this reminder right now that we're getting by teaching this way, that it's an important thing for all of us is useful. And I think that it's valid to like I start my class by just like hanging out and chatting with my students. And I think that's a valid thing to do as adults also, or with adults, and to have some time at the end to hang out and chat, and have time in the middle where we watch each other. Like Betsy was saying, people can take turns having solo time, right? And I talked to you guys about this, but to get really close to the screen can actually be really nice. Hi, everybody, right? Because now we can really see each other. And we can see what's happening, and we can have that feeling of closeness even though we're far away. So, even though you can't see my whole body, right? It's like
your eyes.
I can do a dance with my eyes, right? Like everything's a dance, everything's available.
Great.
So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, André, what are your thoughts as we wrap up?
Well, first, thank you. Thank you for doing this, for organizing this, for bringing us all together. Very grateful. I was thinking about resiliency. I think humans, as a species, we are very resilient and very adaptable. And we have actually, at least, certainly not in our lifetimes, but we all took dance history and learned about the dance macabre. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but after the plague in Europe, that we have always, as a species, found our way through. We have always danced. And I think that we're in the middle of it, but we are finding our way, just the very fact that we're doing this. And there's so many, I've heard so many interesting things in this just past hour that have inspired me in whole new directions. And I actually can't wait to, go try or think about some of these things. So we're doing it. And in years from now, this will be part of dance history. And people will talk about this time of change and how we adapted and what grew from it. And again, I'm not saying everything is fine, but I am saying we are living this time. We're here.
Thank you all. I think you've just been so wonderfully expressive and communicative about the science and the experience. And for everyone listening, thank you for replying. A lot of people definitely saying that their pedagogical approaches and ideas have changed. And I think that was, the underlying goal of this conversation was sort of to help you think about using these limitations as ways to explore new avenues out, and to sort of think about allowing your circumstances and your feelings and the students' feelings to drive your pedagogy, as opposed to using pedagogy to drive your students, and sort of, allow this experience to like reinvent the wheel, and in a maybe new and creative, more successful way. So I certainly feel like I've gotten that from all of you. Thank you so much, André and Laura and Betsy. Thank you so much for your time that you've generously given us, and your expertise. And again, this is part of a whole panel of, or a whole assortment of things that's happening through iAtoms right now. If you want to learn more about iAtoms, we're at www.iatoms.org. Thank you so much.